There's a particular kind of panic that only shows up when you wake up already behind. You know what I mean. Your eyes open, you grab your phone, and immediately you realize something's happened. There's a text you missed. There's an email that came in with like way too many exclamation marks. A calendar alert that you forgot about. Your head pops off the pillow. You're like, oh, that's due today. A bank notification that stops your heart. Those are fun. Before your feet even hit the floor, you've already decided what kind of day this is going to be. You haven't even brushed your teeth, but in your head, you're already writing a manifesto titled, "Everything is terrible and we're probably going to die," which feels dramatic. But sometimes that panic makes sense, right? Like sometimes there really is bad news. Sometimes the diagnosis or the debt or the conflict, the job, the family thing, the church thing, the future thing, the thing you've been trying not to think about is already sitting right outside your door. Fear isn't always lying to us. That's part of what makes fear so powerful. If fear were obviously ridiculous, we'd ignore it much more easily. But a lot of the time, fear has evidence. It can point to real facts. It can say, look at that. Look at what happened. And think about what could happen next. And a lot of the time, fear is telling the truth. It's just rarely telling the whole truth. That's where we're going tonight in this week of our Off the Record Volume 2 series. We've been walking through some of the Bible's stranger, overlooked, and slightly unhinged stories, which is my favorite category of Bible story. These are stories that feel like they barely made it past editors. We talked about talking donkeys, floating axe heads, a guy falling asleep during a sermon and falling out a window, which feels way less like a Bible story and more like an OSHA violation. I'm currently taking an OSHA course, which is as boring as it sounds, but there are all sorts of like little case studies where they tell you about these terrible things that happen. And that story from Acts feels like it could be one that just fit right in there. Tonight's story, though, not OSHA related at all, has fiery horses, an enemy army, confusion, and a dinner party that no one saw coming. So, just normal Bible stuff. But underneath all of it is one of the most human questions in the world, which is, what do we do when fear is the only thing we can see? This story comes from 2 Kings chapter 6. This actually takes place immediately after the floating axe head story that we looked at a few weeks ago. It again involves a prophet, a guy named Elisha. Israel and Aram, or Syria, depending on your translation, are in this ongoing conflict. And not in an abstract sense, like there are people being killed, there are military raids, there's political instability, there's real danger. And Elisha keeps warning Israel where the Aramean army is going to attack next. He knows it ahead of time. And eventually the king of Aram gets so mad because it looks like someone inside his kingdom or his camp is leaking information to the enemy. But his servants tell him basically no, dude, it's Elisha. He knows everything you say, even what you just mutter to yourself under your breath, which had to be an unnerving thing to hear. So the king sends an army to capture Elisha. He's like, fine, that guy must be the problem. They surround the city that he's in at night. And in the morning, Elisha's servant wakes up and goes outside and sees horses and chariots everywhere and panics. Very reasonable response. Here's the passage. This is 2 Kings 6, starting at verse 8. One time, the king of Aram was at war with Israel. After consulting his officers, he said, at such and such a place, I will set an ambush. The holy man, that's Elisha, sent a message to the king of Israel. Watch out when you're passing through this place because Aram has set an ambush there. So the king of Israel sent word concerning the place of which the holy man had warned him. This kind of thing happened all the time. The king of Aram was furious over all this. He called his officers together and said, tell me, who is leaking information to the king of Israel? Who is a spy in our ranks? But one of the men said, no, my master, dear king, it's not any of us. It's Elisha, the prophet in Israel. He tells the king of Israel everything you say, even what you whisper in your bedroom. The king said, go and find out where he is. I'll send someone and capture him. The report came back, he's in Dothan. Then he dispatched horses and chariots, an impressive fighting force. They came by night and surrounded the city. Early in the morning, a servant of the holy man got up and went out. Surprise, horses and chariots surrounding the city. The young man exclaimed, oh, master, what shall we do? He said, don't worry about it. There are more on our side than on their side. Then Elisha prayed, "Oh God, open his eyes and let him see." The eyes of the young man were opened, and he saw a wonder. The hills were full of horses and chariots of fire surrounding Elisha. When the Arameans attacked, Elisha prayed to God, "Strike these people blind." And God struck them blind, just as Elisha had said. Then Elisha called out to them, "Not that way, not this city. Follow me. I'll lead you to the man you're looking for." And he led them into Samaria, which is the capital of Israel at this time. As they entered the city, Elisha prayed, "Oh God, open their eyes so that they can see where they are." God opened their eyes. They looked around. They were trapped in Samaria. When the king of Israel saw them, he said to Elisha, "Shall I massacre the lot?" "Not on your life," said Elisha. "You didn't lift a hand to capture them, and now you're going to kill them? No, sir, make a feast for them and send them back to their master." So he prepared a huge feast for them. After they ate and drank their fill, he dismissed them. Then they returned home to their master, and the raiding bands of Aram didn't bother Israel anymore. This is another one of those stories that I don't know that I had really heard before. But so the servant wakes up, he sees the army, and he says, "Oh no, what are we going to do?" And I just want to say, yes, that is a fair question, to waking up and seeing that outside your door. It's an entirely reasonable response. He's seeing something real. There's an enemy army surrounding the city. There are horses, there are chariots, there are soldiers who didn't come for brunch. Fear is appropriate when danger is real. But sometimes we can talk about fear in a way that makes it sound like fear is always a failure. Like if you were just more faithful, you'd never be anxious. You'd never feel scared. You'd never wake up with your chest tight or your mind racing. But that's just not how humans work. Fear is part of how we survive. Your brain is wired to notice threats quickly, sometimes before your conscious mind has even caught up. The amygdala, which is a part of your brain's threat detection system, is constantly scanning for danger, always. It doesn't sit down with a cup of coffee and calmly weigh all the evidence. It just reacts fast because fast reactions are what keep you alive, which is helpful when there's an actual threat. It's less helpful when the threat is an awkward email or a vague text that says, "We need to talk," or someone using your full name from across the house. It's terrifying. The survival part of your brain isn't very good at critical analysis, which means your survival brain, when it senses danger, it doesn't politely wait for your thinking brain to catch up. It mobilizes the body. Stress hormones rise, your muscles tighten, your attention narrows. Your system prepares for fight, flight, or freeze. So when the servant panics, this story isn't mocking him for that. It's showing us something just painfully normal. He sees danger, and his body believes the danger is the whole story. Because that's what fear does. Fear narrows the frame. It zooms in on the threat until the threat fills the whole screen. It doesn't necessarily invent the army, it doesn't necessarily invent the threat, but it can make the army the only thing you're able to see. What stands out is that Elisha doesn't argue with his servant's fear. He doesn't correct the facts, he just responds to them differently. Elisha knows the army's there. His response is, "Don't be afraid. There are more on our side than theirs," which is a crazy bold thing to say because from the servant's perspective, there are exactly two of them and an entire army outside. I think this is one of those moments where faith can sound ridiculous if we're not careful. Sometimes people use faith language to skip over reality. Maybe you've experienced this. People will say something like, "Don't be afraid." And what they mean is, "Stop making me uncomfortable with your fear." Or they'll say, "God's got this," in a way that just shuts down the conversation rather than trying to stay present with someone's pain. Elijah is taking the servant's fear seriously, but he's refusing to let that fear be the final interpreter of reality. He's inviting him to see more. So his prayer isn't "God, make the army disappear." At least not yet. Elisha prays, "Open his eyes." Open his eyes so he can see what's already true but currently hidden from him. Which at least suggests that the servant's biggest problem in that moment isn't that he sees danger. The problem is danger is all he's seeing. A lot of what faith forms in us is the ability to ask whether the visible problem is the only reality in the room. Faith doesn't require us to pretend that the world is fine. Faith invites us to live with our eyes open, wider than our fear. Because there are times when the facts are real, but they're incomplete. The diagnosis is real, and the support is real too. The conflict is real, and the possibility of repair may also be real. The loss is real, and the presence of God in that loss is also real. The army is real, and the hills are full. I think this is why Scripture keeps telling people over and over again to remember. Remember the Exodus out of Egypt. Remember the manna in the desert. Remember the communion table. Remember the resurrection. Remember, 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 over and over and over again. Because fear gives us amnesia. It makes us forget every time we've been helped before. It makes us forget the people who've carried us, the doors that opened for us, the grace that showed up, the strength that we found, and the way God somehow met us in places that we thought we wouldn't survive. Elijah's prayer is about perception. Open his eyes. And maybe that's a prayer some of us need more than we realize. Like, the situation may still be hard. The threat may still be real. But there's always, also, almost always, something more that's happening than our fear is willing to report back to us. So God opens the servant's eyes and he sees the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around, which is obviously that's a pretty strong visual. Some of us are just asking God for a little reassurance. And this guy gets a flaming heavenly cavalry, which, must be nice. But the point of the vision isn't like spectacle or display of God's power. The point is they're not alone. The servant thought the visible army was the final word, but it wasn't. The hills were full before he saw them. I think sometimes it's really easy for us to think that faith enables God's presence. Like if we believe hard enough, then God shows up, which is really just another way that we try to control God. And in this story, the help is already there, long before any kind of faith. The prayer opens the servant's eyes to what's been true the whole time. Now, this doesn't answer every question, right? It doesn't make suffering simple. It doesn't mean that every danger just disappears. Plenty of faithful people still suffer. You don't need me to tell you that. The Bible is honest about that. It's surprisingly, annoyingly honest about that sometimes. It doesn't let us turn faith into some mystical bubble wrap we get to put on. But this story does ask us to be skeptical of fear's version of reality. Fear says you're alone. Maybe that's not the whole truth. Fear says there's no way through, or the enemy, or this problem, this loss, this failure. This gets to define everything now. But maybe that's not the whole truth. I think this is where the story, if we let it, it can press into our imagination. And I don't mean imagination as pretend. I mean imagination as the capacity to perceive possibility beyond what's immediately obvious. And that begins here with vision. Before the servant can even imagine a different response, he has to see a different reality. That's just how courage works. Courage usually doesn't begin with suddenly feeling invincible, right? Courage begins when fear is no longer the only voice you're listening to. It begins when someone tells you, look again. It begins when a friend reminds you who you really are. It begins when prayer makes enough space inside of you to breathe. It begins when the community holds hope for you until you can remember how to hold it for yourself. Sometimes the hills being full looks like a person who texts you at the right moment. Sometimes it looks like a meal train, or a recovery group, or a friend with a truck, a counselor with a good question, a spouse or close friend who says, we got this. We'll handle this one step at a time. Sometimes it looks like the quiet conviction that God is still present, even when nothing about the situation feels resolved. The hills are full. That doesn't mean the army isn't real. It means the army isn't the only thing there. So maybe the first act of faith in this story isn't pretending to not be afraid. Maybe it's being honest about what fear is doing in us and refusing that to let that be the whole story. Because naming the army is one thing. Letting the army define reality is something completely different. Now, if the story ended with the servant seeing the fiery army, we'd still have a pretty good story to talk about. We could talk about fear, we could talk about perception, we could talk about unseen help, and we could all go home encouraged. Slightly jealous, maybe, of flaming horses showing up when we need them, but encouraged. But the weirdest part of the story comes after all of that. Elisha prays again, and the Aramean army is struck blind or just confused. Then Elisha sends them into Samaria, which, as I said, was the capital city of Israel at that time. That's the last place you wanted to be if you were them. When their eyes are open, they realize that everything's been turned on them, and they're the ones that are now surrounded and trapped. So the whole thing has flipped. The people who came to capture Elijah have now been captured. The enemy army now is the vulnerable ones. And the king sees them and immediately asks, well, should I kill them all? That seems reasonable. And Elijah says, no. Instead, he says, set food and water before them so they may eat and drink, and then let them go back home. That's wild. That's not something you did in the Iron Age. This is where the story refuses to be like this simple power fantasy, right? Because if you or I were writing the story, it'd probably end with the bad guys getting what's coming to them. That's the ending we're trained to expect. The enemy surrounds you, God surrounds the enemy, and then comes their dramatic victory. Cue the music, roll the credits, the end. But Elijah doesn't use this divine protection as permission for payback. He uses it as freedom to break the cycle. That's the reversal of this story. The servant needed his eyes open to see God's help. The king needed his imagination open to see something other than revenge. Because once the enemy is powerless, the question becomes, what kind of people are we going to be now? And that question is everywhere. When you finally have the upper hand, what do you do with it? When someone who hurt you is exposed, what do you do with that moment? When you could humiliate them, or clap back, or pile on, or tell the story in the least generous way possible, or make sure they feel the same fear that they gave you, what kind of person do you become in that moment? Let's be clear, this story isn't saying there should be no justice. It's not telling people to stay in unsafe situations. It's not asking victims to feed abusers and call it holiness. Please don't do that with this passage. That's how people get hurt, and then someone quotes the Bible badly over the wreckage left behind. Elisha is dealing with disarmed soldiers under the power of the king. The immediate threat has been neutralized. The question is what Israel will do when the army can no longer harm them in that moment. And Elisha's answer is feed them. This is such a strange and beautiful kind of strength. It's easy to mistake restraint for weakness, but it isn't. Sometimes restraint requires far more strength than retaliation. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to become a mirror of what wounded you, which just feels so deeply connected to the way of Jesus. Jesus tells his followers to love their enemies and pray for those who persecute them. He tells them to turn the other cheek, to refuse the escalation game, to break the logic that says violence gets to set the terms for everyone. Then on the cross, he absorbs human violence without passing it along. That kind of love has weight to it. It absorbs the impulse to strike back and refuses to let violence dictate the next move. And in that light, this story of an unexpected feast between enemies feels like a glimpse of Christ in the world, long before he shows up. Walter Brueggemann, an Old Testament scholar and theologian, says of this story, the cycle of violent brutality was broken by the surprising offer of food. That's the kind of line that you can only say because the story is so strange. An army comes in violence, and a prophet answers them with a feast. That's not the same as pretending that there was no harm done. Instead, it's having enough imagination to choose a response that doesn't let your wounds and your anger and your fear reproduce themselves unchecked. I think a lot of us need that kind of imagination right now. Because we live in a world that trains us to stay surrounded, right? Surrounded by threats, surrounded by outrage, surrounded by contempt, surrounded by stories that flatten other people into enemies and flatten us into our fear. And then this weird old story says, open your eyes. Maybe you're more surrounded by grace than you thought. Maybe you're more supported than fear has allowed you to see. Maybe the person across from you is more human than your anger has allowed you to admit. So maybe strength looks like refusing to panic. Maybe it looks like refusing revenge. Maybe strength looks like setting the table when every instinct says, sharpen your sword. Now, it's easy for a story like this to stay weird and distant if we leave it in the wilderness with chariots of fire and ancient armies. But the point of Scripture isn't just that something strange happened back then. The invitation is to let God open our eyes here and now, in the places where fear has narrowed our vision and pain has narrowed our responses. So, as we do every week, here are a few reflection questions for you to sit with and think more deeply about this story this week. The first is, where do you feel surrounded right now? Where are things closing in on you? Then what might fear be showing you, and what might fear be hiding from you? Which can be a difficult question to ask, but if you sit with it and allow yourself to have some imagination, what might fear be hiding from you? Where might God be inviting you to respond with courage instead of panic, or restraint instead of revenge? This story begins with a man waking up to an army outside the city, which is just already a nightmare. But it doesn't end where it begins. It begins with fear, but it moves toward vision. It begins with threat, but it moves toward help. It begins with enemies surrounding the city, but it ends with enemies eating at a table together. That's the movement I don't want you to miss. God doesn't scold the servant for being afraid. God opens his eyes. God doesn't pretend the army isn't real. God reveals the army isn't the whole story. God doesn't give Elijah protection so he can pass violence back across the table. God gives him enough security to choose a different and better ending. So maybe that's the invitation for us too, to bring our fear honestly before God without letting fear become our only narrator, to ask for opened eyes when the threat fills the whole frame, to notice the help that's already around us, the people, the grace, the presence, the strength, the Spirit of God, the quiet gifts we miss when we're scanning only for danger. And then when we're no longer convinced we're alone, we're invited to ask what kind of people we want to become. Because fear makes us reactive. Pain can make us vengeful. Anxiety can shrink our world until everyone looks like a threat to us. But the way of Jesus keeps inviting us into having a wider and wider imagination. A world where enemies don't always have to stay enemies. A world where power doesn't have to become payback. A world where tables can interrupt cycles of pain. A world where the hills are full, even when we can't see them yet. So, in the midst of the many fears that we experience in our everyday lives, may we have the humility to ask God to open our eyes to the bigger story. May we notice the help and the grace and the people already around us. And may we become people who break cycles of fear with courage and cycles of wounds with love. Would you pray with me?